Okay, can you hear me? Great. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Kevin McClellan. I'm a principal at PwC in our Medtech strategy practice. And, oops, I'm sorry. Should have gone with the note cards. I'm joined this morning by Cynthia Yee, who's a principal at Vensana Capital, which is a Medtech-focused investor, and Paul Marcoon, who's the EVP of Coloplast and responsible for their global commercial organization. So thank you both for joining me. The topic this morning is how Medtech can accelerate growth through new collaboration models. And the backdrop for this is really the major trends that we see driving the market. And those are things like the continued pressure on healthcare delivery. We've all heard about or dealt with everything from nursing shortages to price pressure, inflationary pressure. So there's a tremendous amount of just macro factors that are driving the health system. In parallel, there's an explosion of connected devices, the availability of data, and really things that are enabling patients to take better care of themselves and more control of their own health journey. And then the third trend we're seeing is really just a continued increase in government intervention in healthcare. And so, as we were prepping for this, our third panelist, who unfortunately is not with us, is the VP of Population at Population Health at Geisinger, explained it in a way that I thought was helpful, which is you've got two major strategies that the payers and providers are pursuing, at least in the U.S. market. One is around the hyper efficiency fee-for-service model, but the other, an important model, is the value-based care model, right, which I think we see a lot of migration towards. And so, part of the backdrop for this is how are medtech companies approaching organizations that are pursuing each of those, right? It's a different ballgame. So, I think everybody is looking for better outcomes at lower costs, right? And, we're all sort of approaching that in different ways. I will turn it to our panelists now to start the discussion. Cynthia, you had an interesting point of view, which is really that in order for medtech to continue to grow and prosper, we've got to find patients earlier, we've got to drive earlier intervention, and essentially expand the pie. Welcome your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think we've done a really great job over the last several decades developing really innovative therapies to treat patients with severe disease. But I think what we haven't done a great job of is really trying to find patients who are either not diagnosed, or undertreated. And so what we've been doing at Vensana is really spending time thinking about, how can we find these patients? How can we diagnose them better? How can we really figure out when to treat them appropriately? So we've made several investments in the last 2 years that have been focused on that thesis of really driving earlier diagnosis and detection in order to sort of grow the overall pie for everyone.
Yeah, can you share some examples, maybe an example of one of those investments and what they're doing?
Yeah, one investment is called Clearly Health. It's a software as a medical device that's using AI to analyze coronary CT angiographies in tracking and characterizing plaque longitudinally in a patient to understand if their disease is progressing. Because right now the standard of care is really looking at LDL and HDL and cholesterol, and that's actually not a good predictor of heart disease. 50% of patients with a heart attack actually present with no symptoms because we're not actually diagnosing and treating what's the actual disease, which is sort of atherosclerosis. And so that is one company that is really looking at trying to track patients over time to see if we can intervene earlier with more aggressive medical therapy, and then if necessary, interventional therapy, be it a stent or a bypass if you're catching it later.
Yeah, no, that's great. Paul, you're along a similar vein, looking at how to help patients manage longitudinal care for themselves. And I know you're in the midst of a launch for a pretty interesting connected product. Would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Good morning, everybody. So at Coloplast, we make products for ostomy care and continence care, particularly in the post-surgical environment. And the trend you talk about is certainly something we're seeing globally right now. I think the other trend that's becoming increasingly compelling is the access of patients and consumers to smartphones, data, connectivity in general, and also with that comes empowerment and people looking to empower themselves with respect to treating themselves. And at Coloplast, we're launching right now, or in the process of doing that, the first electronic leakage system for somebody with an ostomy product. For those of you that aren't aware, an ostomy is a exteriorized piece of the bowel, typically after bowel cancer, if you wish. And depending on the surgery, they either have that bag for a temporary period, 3 to 6 months, or for the rest of their lives. And the number one concern for people with ostomy is, will the bag leak? It's a psychological concern versus a medical concern, if you wish, but it really does impact quality of life. And as I said, we're in the process now of launching a product that sits under the ostomy bag, concentric electronic circles, which connects via transmitter to an app, which means people can real time monitor the leakage of the bag. And the benefits we're seeing already psychologically, still in pilot phases, and what they report back to us is, finally I can get an 8-hour sleep, because I'm not worried about, will this bag leak and explode in the bed, or will I get on a flight from Los Angeles to London and worry about a breakage. And it's very intriguing. We're launching it in Germany and the UK, intentionally in the US subsequently, but we're finding, whilst we've been able to deliver the product technically, we run up against a number of barriers in the marketplace to bring it to market.
Yeah, and I think, we had a healthy debate in our prep calls, right, around how do you derive value from these things, right? I know Sierra at Geisinger was describing how they've been able to drive $4,800 per patient per year out of chronic diabetes care. So there's a proof point there. However, you have to start and actually have some runway to prove these things. So in both of your examples, right, I think clinical data plays a role, but proving the economic case is incredibly important to convincing people that this is actually worthwhile, right? So maybe just your thoughts on how that's going to play out.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Quickly, the patients are very receptive to being connected and to being able to manage personalised care, if you wish. Our two areas of challenge, one is legislative, if you wish, around HIPAA, GDPR, all this transmission of sensitive patient data. How is it transmitted? Where's it stored? Particularly if you're a multinational, do you store it in Europe? Do you store it in the US? Can you store it in the cloud? So that's one area of challenge. The other one's the payer environment, because we're historically a classic Medtech company which sell products and devices and get remunerated for that. Now our discussion with payers is more around population health, patient outcomes. How do you set a benchmark for that? What's the burden of illness, and then what savings can you then deliver to a healthcare system which justifies the payment of the product? And as a company, we're working through that capability, but we're also finding, particularly in the digital space, that payers are also struggling to work out, how do we attribute value to that?
Are your customers willing to pay for it themselves?
To be determined. We're getting there. So we're first launching it in Germany, and they're quite advanced in that they've set up a reimbursement system for digital applications. In the British system, it's the NHS, so it's a single payer environment. They're very open to it because they look at things on a systematic basis. The US is a little more challenging because of the fragmented payer environment, is how can you demonstrate something with longer term or longitudinal value when customers and patients are changing plans on a relatively frequent basis.
Yeah, and I'm curious, Cynthia, your experience in the cardiovascular space, particularly where what you're describing can be a very long-term payback, right? And we talked about the short-termism challenge, particularly in the commercial payer space, where they're holding on to patients for 2.5, less than 3 years. How do you put value on a 10-year plus ROI?
I mean, clearly he's planning to run a 5-year longitudinal study in order to try to drive reimbursement. But that is a big question. And I think it's a question that we ask ourselves all the time when we look at these digital technologies and monitoring software as medical device companies is, who's willing to pay for it? Because certainly there's, even as, my thesis on trying to diagnose and find patients earlier, we still go, well, is anyone willing to pay for this technology? Is it going to be an add-on technology or feature that you as a medical device manufacturer are using to drive differentiation between your competitors, or is it going to be something that, reimbursement, CMS or hospitals are going to get paid for? And so we kind of try to think about the business model. And I don't think there's any one right answer, but it's something that we're kind of working through in real time.
Yeah, we're piloting this product that's called Halo in the UK and Germany because we want to test the product not from a technical perspective, we know it works, but more from a payer pilot, if you wish. How do we engage with a single payer system such as the NHS, a lot of the socialised medicine countries that you see in Europe, versus Germany, which to some degree is a degree of similarity to the US, where it's quite fragmented. You've got a lot of what they call sick funds over there, and where we're getting paid more on population health and looking after a patient pool in a particular area. And the value stream for us is, or how do you monetize improved patient outcomes? You have to set a baseline. This is a burden of illness. This is what's happening today. And this is what we expect with this type of technology, to be able to reduce that burden of illness on the system. And then the big discussion is, okay, so who divides the benefit of that? Is it to the company? Is it to the trade, if you like? Or is it getting reinvested back into the system itself?
Yeah, and so these are a lot of big structural questions, right?
Yeah.
Because you're talking about you've got a risk element, right, in setting the baseline. You've got to measure the performance against that baseline. Yep. You also have timing risk, right? And then you've got, sort of a financial underwriting aspect, if you will, in terms of when people get paid. In thinking about new collaborations, right, maybe another related question is there room for new players, right, a different type of participant in this system who can bridge some of those gaps?
Do you want to crack at that?
I'm not sure who the new players are that are going to solve all our problems, but...
Well, and we've had plenty of folks taking a run at this, right? Typically from outside the sector, one could argue with somewhat limited success. There are a ton of new entrants, trying to participate here. I think folks get very focused on the data and controlling the data, but I think, as you both have described, there are some real structural challenges to solve that are not necessarily, just about the data.
Yeah, the data issues are one that has to be thought through very, very carefully. And one of the challenges we see is it's a little bit like the payer environment is governments and data protection officers and companies of countries, etc., are really struggling with this as well, right? And that brings with it non-conformity of standardization of the data. The challenges that we see as a multinational based out of Copenhagen is how much data can be brought into Copenhagen out of the US or China or even other parts of Europe, Australia, for example, or is it held in the cloud? And then what's the cybersecurity challenge around that as well? So as we go into this world of personalised care and of greater insights into individual healthcare data, cybersecurity and reputational risk is something that we have to carefully think through as well. The other challenge, Kevin, as you said before, around the payers and how much value do you get, as we're building R&D models to figure out what's the payback on a certain investment in R&D, etc., is our monetization or our value flows back into the company aren't as predictable as they are usually with just a fee for service or a fee for product, because they change.
Yes.
Every year they change.
It's variable.
Highly variable.
Cynthia, how are your portfolio companies dealing with this level of uncertainty around things like the reimbursement model, the timing, the efficacy, which is a bit unknown as you enter this space of trying to drive reduced cost in a risk-based population?
I mean, right now, to be candid, a lot of our companies are still operating in a very much fee-for-service environment. There's been some companies that have tried to kind of make the value-based care argument, but I think the challenge with that is that, it kind of works in a closed system like a Geisinger, where it's a payer and provider, and so they're very aligned incentives. But even then, it's still challenging, because then you think about the physicians that are being employed and are still actually compensated on an RVU basis. And so I think until we solve that issue and start sort of incentivizing everyone kind of to work toward the same goals, we're going to constantly run into these challenges. And they're really real. Where you can have people, we had, for one company, the payer had aligned the provider, had aligned the hospital system, but then because we were taking away procedures from certain cardiologists, they did not get behind the procedure and the product, because they felt like you were taking money out of their pockets.
Yeah, incentives matter, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to escape that. What do you see is the potential for breakthroughs here, right? Because I think, as we explore this, there's the real potential that these experiments, get sort of cordoned off and are a relatively modest portion of what we're spending time on as an industry, where I think, we all believe that there's tremendous potential there. So what is the unlock?
Well, Kevin, as I look at it, around the world, we're seeing just escalating pressure on healthcare systems. There's no doubt about that. The constraints that were exacerbated during COVID, particularly the nursing shortage at the moment, is just an inexorable drive towards personalised care. That's not going to go away. And at least on our side of the business, we have to get it right with respect to how do we empower, and what type of education and tools and devices can we provide to enable people, and in our case, they're often in the older demographic, to be able to embrace the technology as well as use a device, and then obviously be reimbursed for doing that. But I feel that there's no choice, whether you be in the US or in Europe. Just the compression that we're seeing on budgets, it's just not going away. I think what is different, though, is the innovation may not be in the structural component of the device so much, but how the data is transmitted, managed, and ultimately used to drive that outcome. And we haven't quite figured that out yet.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. If you look at the high-tech industry, there was a point in time where it was all about hardware innovation, and over time that's really dramatically shifted to software innovation. I think you're seeing that in some sectors of Medtech, particularly things like imaging and capital equipment that runs on much more, software-oriented platforms. Paul, you keyed in on something earlier that I think is a potentially interesting vector around consumer choice. And I think, Cynthia, you asked a question, will patients pay for this out of their own pocket, right? And to me, that is both a really interesting question, and it's a really almost exciting way to think about what's possible. Because if you give something, if you can put something in the market that is so compelling that people will say, "Hey, I want that, and I'm gonna acquire it for my own, with my own funds," that's a bit of a game changer, right? Welcome both of your thoughts on, what that might look like.
Yeah, and I don't think, Kevin, it's a yes or no answer. It really depends on the frequency of consumption and the price of that. But there's no doubt when we've piloted this product, this leak detection device, if you wish, what we found very interesting is patients didn't want to give it back. It was in a prototype environment, controlled experimental environment, and they indicated they would pay. We didn't do any pricing studies at the moment because we believe we'll get it fully reimbursed in both Germany and the UK, but I've got no doubt that if it adds true value, and often, as I said, it's psychological value in our environment versus only medical outcomes, they will pay. So there are co-payment models that are out there. There could be shared risk models that are out there. The challenge we're finding, particularly at the moment, is convincing payers what the baseline to work off is for us to get compensation back for for the value we're delivering through alleviation of costs. For example, people not returning back to hospital, not getting antibiotic treatment for skin, et cetera, because the data's not out there in a consistent form. So often we'll have to go and create that and then sell it to the payers that this data is actually legitimate.
Yeah, you can almost imagine you need a third party to kind of validate it, right? A neutral third party, right?
Yeah, and this is where the medical fraternity comes into it, as well as health economics. That this is a real issue. This is actually costing the payer money, and it's actually good for patient outcomes as well. And I can say payers are becoming quite discerning about that. They're a lot more demanding of us. But on the flip side to that is, if you can prove the case, then they're ready to pay. And that's the early signals we're getting out of Germany right now, which is very encouraging.
Cynthia, what are you seeing in terms of patient willingness to pay or interests and even considering that, versus, what you mentioned is largely a focus on fee-for-service?
I mean, I think you're in any given sort of consumer-focused medical device or diagnostic, you can find some patients who are willing to pay. I just don't know how large that population is and if you can build a scalable business with that sort of model. To your point on sort of baseline and health economics, there actually are a lot of different sort of data providers that are looking at claims data within a particular healthcare system and hospital that can really drill down on sort of the health economics of that patient population in that hospital and facility. And that could be pretty valuable in sort of proving out your case for your device.
Yeah, and we've used it often. And again, it depends on the market you're in. If you're in a national system, they want to see national data, and they only want to see, for example, British data. They don't want to see Canadian data or US data. They want to see particularly to their own environment. But then you're right, you can break it down to account level data, and that's where there's a case for local payment versus national reimbursement.
Yeah.
So there's multi-tiers of payers. They're not ubiquitous.
Yeah.
And that's where we have to build the case from the top down, but also the bottom up.
We're actually using that sort of payer and hospital level claims data as a way to sort of target and have our companies focus their efforts on hospitals or physicians that actually have higher adverse reaction rates or whatever for their devices. And so when you have a problem to solve, I think people are more willing to adopt your technology.
Yeah, and if you can get that readmission rates, antibiotic prescription rates, those sorts of things, they're very compelling for us to put into our model, to build that model. And again, what we're finding is when we go to the payers, and particularly a fragmented payer environment, we have to do that numerous times.
Yeah, it's expensive and timely and costly.
It is, but it's worth it. We'll get there with it.
So it sounds like you guys are having to be more capable at managing data on a much more granular basis than we've had to in the past, right? That typically is a capability you have to build over time, right? It's not something you can just wake up on Monday morning and be good at. Talk a little bit about what that looks like. How are you building that, Paul and Cynthia, for your portfolio companies? What are they doing?
There's two parts to it, Kevin. One is getting the right talent that live in that environment. If you like, the e-commerce environment, and they're often from outside of the industry. They're often from FMCG or insurance or wherever they may be, where they're very, very savvy at being able to analyse or meta-analyse patient data and then take it down, or individual population data and take it down to the individual behaviour. And then the other part to it is IT infrastructure as well. And there's two parts to it. One is the analytics and being able to monitor cookies and analyse those, but also and I hate to overemphasise it, but it's just so important, the cyber security that you have to put into it now is just incredibly important, because you have a breach. It's not only about the breach, but the reputational damage that does, particularly in healthcare, is significant. But we're moving towards a consumer healthcare company just because of the very nature of our products. So we've got to get this right. And already it's been an 8-year journey for us, and we're still not quite there yet.
Yeah, no doubt. And it is challenging. I think, but curious what you're seeing, Cynthia, and maybe also just comment on the availability of talent. I mean, some of these challenges are not industry specific, right? And so there's a big shortage of tech talent, generally speaking.
I mean, I think for startups, we don't expect that talent to be located in-house, so we're typically going to service providers that are providing these types of services, whether it's data security, storage, management of data, analytics for the data. It's not something that we expect these companies to have in-house, and so they'll usually go outside.
Yeah, no, makes sense. Makes sense.
What we're finding, Kevin, with tech talent is, and it's a trend that we've seen over the last couple of years particularly, is people in the industry are now looking to work for companies with purpose, particularly the younger generation. And they're very demanding on us, not only in terms of what's your purpose in terms of delivering care, but also things like sustainability and the ecology of the planet, et cetera, et cetera. They're becoming quite demanding. Less about monetary remuneration, but more about purpose and being value driven. So in fact, that's actually our biggest value proposition, is applying your technical capabilities and competencies into something meaningful. The challenge is, of course, we're seeing a lot of medtech companies going down the same route. So we're seeing this war for talent between medtech companies is where we're going towards personalised care.
Yeah, I hear that a lot, and I think as an industry, we've been a little bit slow to pick up on it. Sounds like it is picking up speed, and now you'll start to subsegment people into which types of mission they want to pursue, right? So that's encouraging, and both I think maybe another challenge, right? Which is how do you differentiate yourself to attract these types of folks to solve the problems you're trying to solve.
One of the other dilemmas is, as a company, how deep do you want to be in terms of intervening in the pathway, right? Where do you, if you're looking after personalised healthcare and the information's coming back to you, when do you refer a patient back to the hospital or the clinic, or where do you provide advice yourself? And that can be quite a blurry line that you have to be very, very clear on the delineation between what we're authorised to advise upon versus when do you refer back. And it's not only a sensitivity for the company, but often with the clinicians as well.
Yeah, no, it's a great point as the lines start to blur. Well, maybe final thoughts from each of you. I think, as we look forward, what are you most excited about with respect to, driving these new models, and maybe one thing that you remain concerned about? Cynthia?
I mean, I am excited that there is a focus on value-based care. I think we're still several years away from that actually being a reality in the U.S., but I'm excited that that's where we realize we're having to go toward, and I think you are seeing it in certain disease states in Medicare, whether it's ortho or dialysis, where you are sort of being driven towards sort of bundled payments, and maybe that's a dirty word in our space, but if we want to do better in healthcare, we can't continue to spend like we're spending in really inefficient and ineffective ways. Yeah,
great. Paul, closing thoughts?
We're very excited about the trend because, at least for us as a company, we're built on servicing consumers really for the rest of their lives with devices they'll use every day. And we can see that the trend is only going that way. And the new technology will support that, AI and the smartphone technology. It's only getting better and better. So our ability to have a direct connection with users is just going in that direction. I think my biggest concern is, can governments and legislators provide the sufficient corner flags, if you like, or corridors for us to be able to operate in a meaningful way, an effective way, without putting ourselves in jeopardy or patients. It's the hardest, and they're struggling with this as well.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, thank you both.
Thank you, Kevin.
Enjoyed the discussion, and I think you'll be around for a few minutes in case folks have questions after the panel. But otherwise, thanks for joining, and have a great conference.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.